This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update with Tyler Cozzens, agricultural economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, begins today's show. He talks about the current market and what is happening in the industry that is impacting it. Continuing the show is K-State Extension agronomists Logan Simon and Lucas Haag with reminders about planting cotton. They explain the importance of soil temperature and moisture. Joe Gerken wraps up today's show as he says how bluegill will begin spawning soon. This K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension specialist also says when the best time to try and catch them is. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week we're joined by agricultural economist Tyler Cozzens from the Livestock Marketing Information Center. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Thanks for having me join you.
Tyler, as we're talking about this cattle market update, can you just give us a rundown of what we're seeing in the market?
Sure, yeah. So I think kind of overall looking at some of the prices that we saw this last week, looking specifically at the feeder, steer, and heifer side of things, on the feeder steer side of things overall compared to the prior week, those lighter weight steers weighing less than about 150 pounds sold a little bit higher, but those steers weighing over 180 pounds were steady to slightly lower than the prior week. So looking a little bit closer at those feeder steer prices by weight groups, those 5 to 6 weights, those were up about $26 from last week, so a pretty strong gain there to $319. The 6 to 7 weight steers were about $14 higher over last week to $289. 7 to 8 weights were $7 higher to $270. 8 to 9 weight steers increased about $2 compared to last week to $234. And then those 900 to 1,000 pound steers lost about $5 from last week to $217. Now on the heifer side, the fed heifer weights were a little bit higher than what we saw a week ago. 5 to 6 weights bounced back this week with prices at $294. That's up about $29 from last week. 6 to 7 weight heifers hit almost $250. That's up about $8 from last week. 7 to 8 weight heifers increased more than $11 from last week to $235. Those 8 to 9 weight heifers were up $10 from last week to $213. Then those heavier 900 to 1,000 pound heifers were $194. That's up about $2 from the prior week. So overall, feeder, steer, and heifer prices showed a modest improvement over what we saw last week, with largely the gains being recognized in those lighter weight feeder, steer, and heifer prices. Now, kind of switching over to some of what we saw as far as the fed cattle side of things, 5 area average live prices for steer and heifers, the USDA reported those negotiated cash prices range from 181 to 183 with a weighted average price of 182. This is actually down about $1 from what we saw prices were at last week. But compared to last year, Fed prices are tracking about $4 to $6 higher. So a little bit weaker tone in the past few weeks. We got compared to a year ago, a little bit higher. Now, I think one of the things we have to kind of consider here, the last few weeks have been a little bit lower prices on the fed cattle side of things, but kind of watching this as we're getting close to this Memorial Day season, that really is kind of the unofficial start to the grilling season. So looking to that to see if we can see a little bit of boost in prices. Looking on the dressed side of things, as far as steer and heifer prices, those ranged from about $290 to $292 last week. That's even to slightly lower from what prices were a week ago. Prices last week were about $292. Compared to a year ago, dress prices are about $5 to $7 higher. Now, if we kind of look at more on the box beef prices side of things, specifically looking at the choice box beef prices, those were steady to slightly weaker tone compared to last week. Prices range from about $295 to $297 throughout the week, which is down about $1 from what we saw just a week ago. So the slightly weaker tone in the cutout value was due to lower primal values for specifically the rib, loin, and the brisket. The chuck, round, and short plate were even to slightly lower from what we saw last week, and the flank was really the only primal value that showed a marginal increase from a week ago. So overall, a slightly weaker tone for cattle and beef prices in recent weeks. Seasonally, though, as I mentioned, the Memorial Day is right around the corner, so that's kind of the unofficial start to the grilling season. This does tend to bring some stronger beef demand as we get into the summer season, so hopefully that will generate some price strength as we move into the summer months. Now, one of the things I've been looking at here over the last week or so is specifically the choice minus select cutout spread, kind of refer to that as the choice select spread. So when we kind of look at this spread, what we're looking at is really it's just a measure that we're using to determine the relative strength of the choice cutout value versus the select cutout value. So when we look at this, so a wide spread between the choice minus select value, that implies that the choice cutout value is stronger than the select value. Conversely, a narrow choice minus select spread value would imply that the select cutout value is stronger. So when we look at this now, this choice minus select beef price spread is actually tracking fairly narrow here for the last few weeks. Last week, the spread was $6.44 per hundredweight, but only a few weeks ago it was actually below $3, right? So this is actually some of the narrowest we've seen this spread be since about late February of 2022, when it was actually below $2. So the recent trend over narrow choice minus select spread is a counter seasonal move from what we've seen last year and actually over the last 5 years. This time of year, we usually see a spread that's about $10 to $20, and last week it was just over $6. When we're looking at actually the spread of what we saw last year, the spread actually was over $30 by the time we got to about July, and averaged about $27 during the second half of the year. So a pretty strong spread there, indicating a pretty good value or a higher value for the choice cutout value. Now, the recent narrow choice minus select spread has been due to a slight decline in the choice cutout value, ranging from about $300 to $310 per hundredweight for several weeks, while the select cutout has actually been tracking about $290 to $300 per hundredweight. And this is quite a bit higher than what we saw last year. Last year, it was, at this time of the year, is actually about $270 to $280 per hundredweight, and the 5-year average for this year for the select cutout value is typically around $230 to $240. So we're seeing about a roughly $60 increase from what we typically have seen over the last 5 years. We got the grilling season right around the corner, and kind of the seasonal trend for the choice select spread is typically to widen and see a little bit more gain in that choice cutout value. So that's one of the things I'll be looking at here over the next few weeks as we get closer to Memorial Day.
Tyler, you mentioned how the grilling season can make impacts to the cattle market, and something else that's making impacts right now a little bit, HPAI.
Correct. Yeah, we've kind of seen some things escalate here quickly with highly pathogenic avian influenza, also called HPAI. In recent weeks here, it's been kind of a headline in the news, most notably for its spread from migratory bird populations into the dairy cattle population. So based on latest data from USDA APHIS, they're reporting 33 confirmed cases of HPAI in dairy cattle, and that's across 8 states. The interesting thing with where these cases have been reported in those 8 states, you have about 5 states in the West and Midwest: Idaho, Kansas, New Mexico, South Dakota, and Texas. But then you also have cases that are also reported in Michigan, Ohio, and North Carolina. So geographically, the confirmed cases of HPAI in dairy cattle are spread out across a good portion of the U.S. And I think the other thing to note is they're also spread out across multiple U.S. flyways. And I think this is an indication of a large spread of this HPAI across the U.S. So it's something that is definitely worth monitoring for sure. And with the spread in dairy cattle, this has brought about some recent news releases from USDA. Specifically, USDA, in an effort to stem any further spread of HPAI, this week USDA APHIS issued a federal order which requires testing and reporting of dairy cattle. So this order further states that on April 29th, all dairy cattle will be required to have a negative HPAI test before the cattle can be transported across state lines. The test results must come from an approved National Animal Health Laboratory network. Also in this order, USDA also stated that there will likely be additional conditions set forth by APHIS in an effort to combat further spread of this HPAI strain, which is H5N1. And they actually issued one of those on April 26th. One of those conditions is an amendment specifically to their animal disease traceability regulations. And that regulation now requires electronic ID for certain cattle and bison moving interstate. And in that note, they reported that the final rule applies to all sexually intact cattle and bison 18 months of age or older, all dairy cattle, and bison of any age used for rodeo or recreation events, and cattle or bison of any age used for shows or exhibitions. It also stated in the report that the rule requires official ear tags to be visually and electronically readable for official use for interstate movement of certain cattle and bison, and revises and clarifies certain record requirements related to cattle. USDA did note that they will continue to provide ear tags to producers free of charge to jumpstart efforts to enable the fastest possible response to foreign animal disease. And I think one of the things to note specifically on this order is USDA did note that this will take effect 180 days after publication in the Federal Register. And so one note this for livestock producers, but obviously, keep in mind this is a fluid situation, right? So it's changing rather quickly, especially this last week. We've seen a lot of those changes. So for those livestock producers out there, please be aware of any potential changes that USDA is issuing. So on a similar note with the HPAI discussion, there's been some significant impacts to the poultry sector. Currently, USDA APHIS has reported about 11 million birds affected by HPAI since the start of this year alone. A majority of those cases have actually been in commercial egg layers. The reported cases in commercial eggs have all recently occurred just during the month of April. So in April alone, there was a case of 2 million birds affected in a commercial egg layer flock in Texas. And then over the last 2 weeks, we've had 3 separate cases of 2 million birds each that have occurred in the state of Michigan. Okay, so if you combine both Texas and Michigan, and we've had over 8 million commercial egg layer birds that have been affected by HPAI. So I bring this up as just a note because we had a similar impact in 2022 with HPAI to commercial egg layers, and this did impact egg prices as we got into the summer months. So just a note to keep an eye out on those egg prices moving forward here. But kind of wrapping up some of this thoughts on the HPAI stuff, it is concerning and it's changing quickly, and so it merits some watching here as we move out of kind of the spring migratory season. But hopefully as we get out of the next few weeks here, typically what we've seen in the past is some of these HPAI cases start to slow down, and hopefully we'll see a reduction in the number of cases as we move into the summer months.
Tyler, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us a market update.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That was agricultural economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show talking about cotton planting considerations. And to talk about it, we're joined by 2 K-State Extension agronomists, Logan Simon and Lucas Haag. Logan, Lucas, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Thanks, Shelby.
Logan, starting off our conversation with you, one thing really important when it comes to cotton planting, soil temperatures.
Yes, exactly. So we have kind of what we think about as an ideal planting window in terms of calendar date, but we really don't encourage our growers to fixate too much on calendar dates and rather focus more on soil temperatures. Cotton seed germination and seed growth emergence are we usually think of them as being favored by soil temperatures at 64 degrees and above. We want adequate soil moisture, but not excessive. In Kansas, we tend to use a 60-degree Fahrenheit threshold for cotton in that seed zone. So thinking about where that cotton seed is going to get placed. We've had some warm temperatures this spring. It's been a pretty warm April, but we've had a couple cold snaps come in, some cooler days, and so that has definitely influenced soil temperatures across southern Kansas. Our cotton growing region. Part of that too, with soil temperatures, highly impacted by soil moisture. And we've got dry soil conditions largely across central and western Kansas right now. And an important thing to keep in mind with that is that drier soils tend to have greater temperature change in response to air temperature. So we're seeing our soil temperatures flux around a little bit more than we'd expect if we had a little bit more soil moisture. And so that's why we use our 7-day average. And I went ahead and pulled some 7-day average soil temperatures for a couple sites across our cotton producing region. Just curious about where we're sitting. And I see that right now at Moscow, we're sitting at 61 for an average soil temperature for 7 days. 60 at Harper and 62 at Hutchinson. But here where I'm sitting in Garden City, Kansas, we're only at 56, so we're holding a little bit back further here at this little bit further north than Moscow, and certainly higher elevation than Hutchinson.
And not only important to think about the soil temperature when it's being planted, but also what it's going to look like for the next few days.
Exactly. So soil temperatures and air temperatures, not just at planting, but also in those days after planting. You know, cotton seedlings are most sensitive to cool or cold temperatures in kind of that first 6-7 days after planting. So we really want to be mindful of those. There's a really handy tool out there, and it's mentioned in our most recent article in the Agronomy e-update, is the North Carolina State University Cotton Planting Condition Calculator. It predicts planting conditions based on projected 5-day growing degree day accumulation or growing degree day unit accumulation. And the way that those are broken up is we've got a ranking from very poor up all the way up to excellent based on degree day accumulation. And that really gives us an idea of the kind of conditions that we're going to have following cotton planting. We really want to be in that good, very good to excellent range when we're talking about that time after cotton planting. To give you an idea of where we're at right now in South Central and Southwest Kansas, in Harper, that real South Central location, we're sitting at good for the next week or so. Go a little bit north to Hutchinson, more adequate to good. And certainly as you get out to Southwest Kansas at those higher elevation sites, at Moscow, we're sitting at marginal to adequate. And here at Garden City, we're sitting at more like poor to marginal. So we got a little ways to go before we'll be hitting good conditions there.
As we are talking about adequate soil moisture and temperature, what are some of the issues or injuries that can happen if those needs aren't met?
Sure, Shelby. So, a lot of the issues we have, as Logan has mentioned, these planting condition outlooks and the importance of looking at that 5 to 7 day forecast, because, cotton's very different than the crops that we're maybe more accustomed to growing to in the state in terms of their sensitivity when water's being imbibed into the seed. And so as that process is going on, the lipids in that seed have to be converted to injury, and any chilling during that process very much kind of shocks that process and subjects that plant to quite a bit of stress and injury, potentially leading to outright seedling death. And so that's a real challenge for us, is because maintaining stands is really important. Cotton seed's expensive. We need to have adequate stands out there to meet our yield potential, and so we really want to get this crop off to a good start. And even some plants may not be outright killed, that stress that they've been subjected to early certainly has effects on that plant down the road in terms of its productivity and its relative competitiveness.
Are there different levels of seed quality when it comes to purchasing cotton?
Yeah, so that's one thing that I think as Kansas has been added into the cotton growing region has forced the seed companies to pay a lot more attention to what is the cold emergence quality of these seed lots. And there's been a lot, some work done on that. And so, one thing we advise producers to ask their seed providers for is information on the cold warm vigor index, or a CWVI score. And so that was developed at Texas, but again, gives some indication of how well a seed lot will perform in a more thermally limited environment like southern Kansas.
Sometimes on those seed tags, do they have warm germination scores and cold germination scores?
Yeah, so a worm germ score is generally found on all the tags. The thing to keep in mind, it is standardized, but it's conducted at, again, as Logan mentioned earlier, more around that 65, 66 degree mark, whereas here in Kansas, we really can't wait for that in order to get our crop in on time. And so there's a little bit of a discrepancy there between that worm germ test that we'd find on a seed tag versus the environment we're trying to put that into here in Kansas. But that is the worm germ test is on the seed tag. But they tend to not be quite as maybe reliable as we are accustomed to in corn and sorghum and our other more common crops.
As we're thinking about all these cotton planting considerations, what are a few key things that you really, really want producers to keep in mind?
So, Shelby, when we're thinking about, planting cotton in Kansas, we're really walking a tightrope here because, we're in a thermally limited environment in terms of cotton production. And so really, especially like on our irrigated acres, our yield limiting factor is how many heat units can we accumulate during the season. So we want to get that crop in on time to give us that maximum opportunity. But the flip side of that is, just as we've been discussing, if we plant that crop too early, if we lose stand, if we subject those seedlings to stress and injury, we're hurting yield potential that way too. And so it is, I think it is probably, one of the more sensitive crops we raise in the state in terms of trying to hit this window of, we want to get it in early so we can get heat units, which means yield. But on the flip side, we also got to be patient. We've got to understand our own unique field conditions to make sure we get that cotton stand off to the strongest start possible.
And to add to what Lucas said, I would just say another thing to keep in mind that we really need to have when it comes to cotton planting is we have a very limited window. And so if we do end up with a poor stand and we're starting to ask that question of, do I have enough of a stand to meet an adequate yield potential, or do I need to think about replanting? Well, again, this is cotton. We're thermally limited. And so our replant options on cotton are going to be really slim, because by the time we get to that point of asking that question, we may be beyond that point where we can realistically be thinking about replanting.
Logan, you mentioned a few different resources in today's show, and could you share with us what a few of your favorites are for growers to check out?
Absolutely. Well, just broadly speaking, one of the best resources out there that every producer, everybody involved in agriculture in Kansas should have bookmarked on their web browser is the Kansas Mesonet. The Kansas Mesonet is a spectacular online resource for all Kansans to access information about air temperature in real time and historic, but also many of our stations are going to be tracking soil temperature. And that just provides a really, really important resource for our folks as we're thinking about this planting season. But remember that this is just going to give us a general idea of where soil temperatures are sitting. There's going to be a lot of variation on the landscape, so we really encourage producers to go out with a thermometer and be checking their own fields. Remember that soil temperature is going to vary with residue cover. We tend to plant a lot of our cotton in high residue conditions, and then that influence of soil moisture as well. So use that Kansas Mesonet as a good general idea, and get out there in those fields with your thermometer and make sure you're out there on the ground.
Those were K-State Extension agronomists Logan Simon and Lucas Haag. If you'd like to read more about cotton planting, you can do so from an April 11th Agronomy E-Update article titled Soil Temperature, Weather Forecast, and Seed Quality Are Critical for Cotton Establishment. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Also in the show notes will be some of the resources that Logan mentioned in today's show. The first one will be the Mesonet website, which you can find by going to Mesonet.ksu.edu. The other one will be the tool from North Carolina State University, which you can find at cotton.ces.ncsu.edu. As I mentioned, all of these will be in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we end our Monday show talking about fish spawning. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist, Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, the first fish for us to talk about today, bluegill when it comes to spawning.
Yeah, so this time of year, spawning season in Kansas really takes like 3 to 4 weeks to really kick off. And so we're starting to see bluegill spawning is coming up on us. We're probably in the pre-spawn stage, but getting close to that spawning stage. And bluegill are the first fish in most of our ponds that we're going to see reproduce. So I thought we could chat about that a little bit.
At what point do they usually start spawning?
So in Kansas, when the water temperatures hit the high 60s or low 70 degrees, you'll start to see them spawn. And so that's right around now in Kansas. Late April, early May is when we start to see the spawning. So if you go down to your pond and walk around the edge, you'll probably see some bluegill hanging out. And they make nests, which are these perfect little circles. They kind of look like crop circles in the pond. Like they almost don't belong there. But the males are making these nests and trying to get the ladyfish to come hang out with them. So you'll get to see that quite a bit this time of year. It's fun to see. Bluegill are the first fish that we're going to see spawn. They're going to reproduce 2 or 3 times throughout the year. So you might see this opportunity later, but this is kind of the big push when you'll first start to see it. And you'll see a lot of those fish hanging out around the edge of the pond.
And their reproduction is something important as a prey?
Yeah, definitely. So, bluegill are really important in our ponds, and they tend to get overlooked, but bluegill are really the foundation in a lot of ways. So they're reproducing, they're making a lot of offspring throughout the year, and all of those offspring, one of their main goals is to serve as prey items for bass. So I tell people, a lot of pond owners want to have really big, largemouth bass in their pond. But to do that, you really have to manage the bluegill population and make sure that those bass have something to eat and they can be happy and healthy.
And when will those bass start repopulating?
Great question. So talking about the bass, the bluegill start first, bass kind of follow up right after that. So similar water temperatures, higher 60s, low 70s, they tend to be a week or two after the bluegill in most Kansas ponds. They have kind of that similar behavior. So the males will make the nests. They'll court the females. The females will come up and pick the nest or the male that they like. And then they'll spawn, and shortly after that, the females take off. So one of the really cool things about largemouth bass is that the males protect the offspring. And so they'll hang out on these nests for 10 to 14 days after the spawn hatch, and you'll have those little fish. They'll take care of them. Then the young fish will start feeding on their own, and they'll tend to kind of disperse, and the males will take off. So this is kind of like a really fun couple-week window that we get to see in Kansas.
And as more males get added to that pond, important to remove some?
Yeah, so a lot of people have been taught that catch and release is what we always want to do, but we have to remember that ponds are closed systems, right? And so if we're adding more mouths, we're adding more fish, we have to remember to take some of those out. And so the recommendation is actually more than people think. In order to make sure that we're not having too many fish in our pond, which can lead to stunted fish or unhealthy fish, we have to harvest some fish. And that recommendation for largemouth bass is about 20 to 25 pounds per acre per year. And so that can be a lot more fish than most people think about taking out of a pond. It is important when you're taking those fish out to try to take small or medium-sized fish out. If you catch a really big fish and really want to hang on to that, you can, but it's best for the pond if you let the big fish go and you keep the little ones to take home.
And is there a time around spawning that's the best to try to catch fish?
Yeah, so fishing is great this time of year. Right before the spawn, the fish are trying to eat a lot, make sure they have a lot of nutrients. So that's when you can go out and you can catch a lot of fish. They're really active. They're really aggressive. And also the females have a bunch of eggs. Female fish get bigger than male fish. And so this is a great opportunity to go catch some of those big females that are full of eggs, and they can be really big. So the pre-spawn is a great time. Right after they spawn, they tend to be a little bit timid, worried more about protecting their babies than they are kind of going out and eating. So the pre-spawn's a great time to fish. Post-spawn, maybe not as much, but it'll be summer soon. There'll be more opportunities coming up.
So go ahead and start getting out your poles and head to the pond?
That's right. Doctor's orders. Go start fishing.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about fish spawning.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.